A young black teacher, just named Educator of the Year, walks into a town hall meeting ready to defend his curriculum and celebrate the progress he's inspired in his students. But in a matter of moments, everything takes a shocking turn. A disgruntled parent singles him out, leveling accusations that ripple through the room. As tensions escalate, he's not just defending his lesson plans. He's fighting for his dignity. What happened next sent shockwaves through the community and sparked a movement no one anticipated. Stay with me. This is a story you don't want to miss. Before we dive in, comment below where you're reading from, and if stories about resilience and justice inspire you. Don't forget to like and share this post to spread the message. It was supposed to be just another meeting, but nothing could prepare him, or the town, for what unfolded next. The streets of Harlem glistened under the dull light of a drizzly autumn afternoon. Rain pooled in uneven cobblestones, catching reflections of neon shop signs and the occasional passing car. Isaiah Reed stood beneath the faded awning of a small corner store. His worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder. A jazz tune hummed faintly from a nearby window, but the music did little to lift the weight pressing on him. Isaiah was a teacher, a role he had come to both cherish and present in equal measure. In his youth, he had envisioned classrooms brimming with eager young minds ready to challenge the world. Yet, after decades in the system, the truth had settled in his bones. Schools were not built to nurture, they were constructed to contain. And for young black students like those he taught, the walls of those classrooms were merely an extension of the larger cage outside. He adjusted his collar and stepped into the shop, the bell above the door jangling faintly. Inside, the smell of fresh bread mingled with the sharp tang of cleaning supplies. The shopkeeper, Mr. Grayson, glanced up from behind the counter, his gaze flickering over Isaiah with a barely veiled scrutiny. "Afternoon," Isaiah said, his voice measured but polite. Mr. Grayson nodded stiffly, his hands busy stacking boxes of cereal on a shelf. "Help you find something?" Isaiah's lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't the words so much as the tone, a tired echo of encounters past. "Just picking up a few things," he replied. As Isaiah moved through the aisles, he could feel the shopkeeper's eyes tracking him. It wasn't overt, never outright hostility, but the quiet insistence of being watched was enough to tighten the knot in his stomach. This wasn't new. In Harlem, in downtown Manhattan, even on the rare trips he took upstate, there was always someone waiting to remind him of his place. He gathered a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, and a bag of coffee beans. As he approached the counter, a middle-aged white woman entered the store, her fur-lined coat dripping rain onto the floor. Mr. Grayson's demeanor shifted instantly. His stiff expression melted into a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Connolly," he greeted warmly. Isaiah placed his items on the counter, his movements deliberate. He waited, but Mr. Grayson remained focused on Mrs. Connolly, who had begun to browse the shelves. "Is there a problem?" Isaiah asked, his tone calm but firm. The shopkeeper blinked, as though startled by Isaiah's voice. No problem," he muttered, reaching for the items on the counter. His hands moved quickly now, scanning the prices and bagging the goods. Isaiah handed over a neatly folded bill, resisting the urge to say more. He had long since learned that pushing too hard only led to escalation. And yet, as he stepped out into the rain, the familiar pang of frustration lingered. Sharp and unforgiving, the city stretched before him, a patchwork of opportunity and exclusion. For every step forward, there seemed to be an invisible force pulling him 2 steps back. He thought of his students, their faces bright with possibility, their voices brimming with questions, and wondered how many of them would one day stand in his shoes, carrying the same weight. As Isaiah walked down the street, a boy's voice called out to him, "Mr. Reed, hey, Mr. Reed." He turned to see Jamal, one of his 6th graders, running toward him, a tattered notebook clutched in his hand. The boy's coat was too thin for the weather, and his sneakers squelched against the wet pavement. "Jamal, you should be home," Isaiah said, concerned with softening his voice. Jamal grinned sheepishly. "I know, but I wanted to show you this." He held up the notebook, its pages filled with messy scrawls and drawings. "I wrote another story. You said to keep practicing, right?" Isaiah smiled despite himself. "That I did. Let me take a look." As he flipped through the pages, the boy's enthusiasm was infectious. But even as he encouraged Jamal's creativity, a shadow loomed in the back of his mind. He knew the world waiting for this bright young boy. A world that too often reduced talent to survival and ambition to disappointment. "Keep writing," Isaiah said, handing the notebook back, "and don't let anyone tell you your voice doesn't matter." Jamal beamed. "I won't, Mr. Reed, thanks." As the boy disappeared down the street, Isaiah stood still, the rain soaking into his jacket. In the distance, he could hear the wail of a police siren, a reminder of how fragile hope could be. The weight of the day hung heavy. But Isaiah kept walking. For all the quiet indignities and unspoken rules, there were still moments, brief, flickering moments, that kept him moving forward. Moments that reminded him the fight was far from over. The following morning, Isaiah walked briskly through the courtyard of the school, his satchel bumping against his side with every step. The cold had settled in overnight, leaving a thin layer of frost on the ground that crunched faintly beneath his polished shoes. The bell had already rung, and the sounds of restless students filtered through the open windows. Inside, the school buzzed with its usual energy, the slap of sneakers on linoleum floors, the echo of laughter and shouting, and the clipped tones of teachers wrangling their students into order. Isaiah made his way to his classroom, nodding to a few colleagues as he passed. His classroom was a modest space. Faded posters of black leaders adorned the walls, and the bulletin board near the window was filled with student projects. The heater clattered noisily in the corner, struggling against the morning chill. Isaiah set his satchel on the desk and began organizing his materials for the day. He had just finished stacking a pile of essays when the principal, Mrs. Watkins, appeared in the doorway. She was a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, her sharp eyes softened only by the streaks of gray in her hair. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. The tightness in her voice immediately caught Isaiah's attention. "Good morning, Mrs. Watkins. Everything is all right?" she sighed, folding her hands in front of her. "I need to speak with you about something that came up at the board meeting last night." Isaiah gestured for her to sit, but she shook her head, remaining by the door. That was never a good sign. "The board is concerned about the curriculum," she continued, "specifically, the readings you've chosen for your literature class." Isaiah frowned. "The readings? We've been studying Baldwin, Morrison, Hughes. What's the concern?" Mrs. Watkins shifted her weight. "There's been a complaint. One of the parents feels the material is too divisive." "Divisive?" Isaiah's voice sharpened. "These are works that explore the truth of our history, our identity. How is that divisive?" She raised a hand, as if to temper his reaction. "I agree with you, Isaiah, but you know how these things go. The parent feels the themes of racism and inequality are too heavy for middle school students." Isaiah stood, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "These students live those themes every day. Pretending they don't doesn't protect them. It blinds them. And what's too heavy is carrying the weight of a history no one wants to teach." Mrs. Watkins nodded solemnly. "I understand your position, but the board wants you to revise the syllabus. They've suggested removing Baldwin and replacing him with," she hesitated, her expression betraying her distaste, "something less controversial." Isaiah felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. But he swallowed it. "And what would that be? A sanitized version of history? A story where no one is to blame?" "I'm on your side," she said quietly, "but my hands are tied. Please, just think about it. I don't want this to escalate." Isaiah watched her leave, the door clicking softly shut behind her. He leaned against his desk, his thoughts swirling. To revise the syllabus felt like a betrayal, not just to the writers who had shaped his own understanding of the world, but to the students who deserved to see their experiences reflected in the texts they studied. The first challenge of the day came during the fourth period. Isaiah's classroom was full, every desk occupied by restless, chattering students. At the front of the room, he held up a copy of Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, his voice cutting through the noise. "All right, settle down," he called. "Today we're discussing the essay we read last night. What Baldwin describes as the dreadful weight of history. Who can tell me what that means?" A few hands shot up, and Isaiah pointed to a girl in the second row. "Tiana? It's like the way history keeps affecting us," she said, "like how people don't forget the bad stuff, even if they say they do." "Good," Isaiah said. "And why do you think Baldwin says we carry this history like a weight?" The room was quiet for a moment before Jamal, sitting near the window, raised his hand. "'Cause it's not just history," he said. "It's still happening." Isaiah nodded, his chest tightening at the boy's words. "Exactly. History isn't just something in books. It's in the way people treat each other today. In this way, systems are built to benefit some and hurt others." The discussion grew lively as students debated Baldwin's ideas, their voices full of the passion Isaiah lived for as a teacher. Yet even as he guided the conversation, the weight of Mrs. Watkins's words lingered in his mind. He could feel the quiet friction between what he was teaching and what the board wanted to suppress. Later that afternoon, as the students filed out, Isaiah stayed behind to grade papers. He had just begun when he heard a knock at the door. Looking up, he saw Jamal standing hesitantly in the doorway. "What's up, Jamal?" Isaiah asked, gesturing for him to come in. The boy shuffled inside, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands. "I wanted to ask you something." "Mr. Reed." "Go ahead." Jamal hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. "Why do people hate us so much?" The question hit Isaiah like a blow. He set his pen down, meeting the boy's troubled gaze. "Jamal, it's not about hate, it's about fear," he said softly. "Fear of what they don't understand. Fear of what they think they'll lose if we have the same opportunities they do." Jamal frowned. "But it's not fair." "No, it's not," Isaiah agreed. "But that's why we have to fight for what's right. That's why your voice, and voices like Baldwin's, are so important. They make people see what they'd rather ignore." Jamal nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. As he left, Isaiah felt both pride and sorrow. The boy's question was simple, but its answer carried centuries of pain. Isaiah knew his students were just beginning to grapple with the weight of their place in the world, a weight he hoped to help them bear. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the classroom, Isaiah sat alone at his desk, the unopened letter from the school board lying beside him. He hadn't yet decided how to respond, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't let his students face the world unarmed. Not if he could help it. The next week unfolded with a subtle tension that Isaiah could feel in the air but couldn't yet name. The weather had turned, bringing a chill that crept into the corners of the school, settling over everything like a second skin. Outside, the trees shed their leaves, bare branches scratching against the gray sky. Inside, the weight of Isaiah's decision to defy the school board pressed against him, a constant reminder that standing firm came with consequences. Isaiah began his day as always, with the ritual of unlocking his classroom and arranging the desks just so. He'd left Baldwin on the syllabus. It wasn't defiance for defiance's sake. It was principle. As he laid out the copies of The Fire Next Time on each desk, he knew he was preparing for battle, though the enemy had yet to fully reveal itself. By second period, the challenge came, not directly, never directly. These battles often began in whispers. Mrs. Watkins appeared again, her expression drawn, the corners of her mouth tight. Isaiah knew the look, not disappointment, but worry. "Isaiah," she began, standing just inside the door. "The board called me this morning." Isaiah gestured for her to continue, keeping his tone even. "And? They've received another complaint." She paused, her gaze flitting to the students settling into their seats. "They're sending someone to observe your class tomorrow." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "An observation? Is this about my teaching or the curriculum?" Mrs. Watkins lowered her voice. "You know what it's about." He nodded, his grip tightening on the stack of papers in his hand. "I'll be ready." Her eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "Just tread carefully. Isaiah, you're good at what you do. But this isn't a fight you want to escalate unnecessarily." When she left, Isaiah turned his focus back to his students, who watched him with wide eyes. Sensing the gravity of the conversation, he smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's dive in, shall we?" The next morning, Isaiah arrived early. The observation was scheduled for the third period, and though he'd planned his lesson carefully, he couldn't shake the feeling that the deck had already been stacked against him. The day began unremarkably. First and second periods passed without incident, the students responding with their usual mix of enthusiasm and distraction. But as the third period approached, the hum of anxiety grew louder in Isaiah's mind. When the observer arrived, Isaiah recognized her immediately. Sarah Aldridge, a representative from the district, was known for her sharp critiques and rigid adherence to policy. She entered the room with the kind of deliberate, measured steps that announced her presence without needing to speak. Her gaze swept over the classroom, assessing every detail before settling on Isaiah. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said, her tone professional but cold. "Good morning, Ms. Aldridge," he replied, his voice steady. "Welcome to my class." She took a seat in the back, her notepad and pen at the ready. Isaiah exhaled slowly and turned to face his students, their expectant faces a reminder of why he was here. "All right," he began, lifting a copy of Baldwin's essay. "Today, we're continuing our discussion of the fire next time. Let's revisit Baldwin's description of identity and power. Who can tell me what Baldwin means when he says, 'Color is not a human or a personal reality, it is a political reality'?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, Tiana raised her hand. "It's like, he's saying race isn't real. But it's made real by how people use it to control things." "Exactly," Isaiah said, nodding. "Race isn't something that exists in our biology. It's something created to define and divide. And what happens when we allow those divisions to shape our society?" Jamal spoke up, his voice firm. "It makes it harder for people to be treated the same. Like, people use race as an excuse to take stuff away from others." "Right," Isaiah said. "And Baldwin's point is that these divisions are not accidental. They're deliberate. So, how do we challenge that?" The discussion unfolded with the kind of energy that made Isaiah's work worthwhile. The students engaged deeply, their ideas bouncing off one another in a rhythm that felt almost musical. Even as Isaiah guided the conversation, he could feel Aldridge's eyes on him, her pen scratching against the notepad. He didn't let it distract him. The students' voices were louder, clearer, and more important than her silent judgments. After class, Aldridge approached him. She waited until the students had filed out, her notepad tucked under one arm. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice clipped, "your students are clearly engaged. But the material you've chosen is provocative." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "Provocative?" "Yes," she said, her tone growing sharper. "Baldwin's work, while historically significant, might be considered inflammatory by some. It's our responsibility to provide an inclusive environment." Isaiah crossed his arms. "And what about the students who see their experiences reflected in Baldwin's words? How do we provide an inclusive environment for them if we erase those reflections?" Aldridge's expression hardened. "This isn't about erasure, Mr. Reed. It's about balance." "Balance," Isaiah repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Balance would mean including voices that have been historically excluded. What you're suggesting is the opposite." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "The board will review your curriculum and make a final determination. In the meantime, I suggest you focus on less contentious material." Isaiah said nothing, his silence speaking volumes. Aldridge left without another word, her heels clicking against the floor like a metronome counting down to an inevitable clash. That evening, as Isaiah sat at his desk grading papers, he replayed the day's events in his mind. The fight he faced wasn't new, but it felt heavier now, as though the stakes had grown higher. He thought of his students, of Tiana, Jamal, and the others who had spoken with such clarity and conviction. They deserved better than silence. They deserved the truth. Isaiah glanced at Baldwin's essay lying open beside him, the words a reminder of the battles fought before him. He picked up his pen and began drafting a letter. A defense of his curriculum. Yes, but more importantly, a defense of his students' right to see the world as it was, not as others wished it to be. The quiet rebellion had begun, and Isaiah knew there was no turning back. Isaiah sat at the long, polished oak table in the school library, where the board held their meetings. The room smelled faintly of dust and varnish, as if years of decisions, some vital, some trivial, had soaked into the wood. He glanced around at the gathered members of the school board, their faces set in varying degrees of indifference and discomfort. Mrs. Watkins sat at one end, her hands folded neatly, her expression unreadable. Across from her was Chairman Wallace, a man whose demeanor was as rigid as the starched collar of his shirt. The letter Isaiah had written lay on the table in front of him, its tone measured but unflinching. It wasn't just a defense of Baldwin or his teaching methods. It was an indictment of a system that claimed to value education while quietly suffocating the voices that made learning transformative. Yet, as he sat there, he knew that the words on that page were a spark in a room full of dry tinder. He had lit it knowing the fire was inevitable. Chairman Wallace cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Mr. Reed, you've been invited here to discuss your curriculum, specifically your inclusion of James Baldwin's The Fire next time. We've received concerns from parents and members of the community about the suitability of this material. We'd like to hear your perspective. Isaiah leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. Chairman Wallace, I appreciate the opportunity to address these concerns. Baldwin's work isn't just literature. It's a lens through which we can examine the complexities of race, identity, and power in America. These are realities our students navigate every day, whether we acknowledge them or not. A woman to Wallace's right, Mrs. Horowitz, raised her hand delicately. Mr. Reed, no one is denying the historical significance of Baldwin's work, but some parents feel the content is too divisive for a high school classroom. Surely there are other texts that address these themes without stirring controversy. Isaiah smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Controversy isn't in Baldwin's words. It's in the world he describes. To shy away from his truth is to deny our students the tools they need to understand their own experiences. How can we prepare them for the future if we refuse to show them the past? The room grew heavier with each word. Isaiah saw the subtle shifts in posture. The exchanged glances. Some board members looked away, their expressions strained, as if they wished he would stop speaking. Others seemed torn, their neutrality cracking under the weight of the discussion. It was then that Chairman Wallace leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. Mr. Reed, we are here to serve the entire community. That means balancing perspectives. What would you say to the parents who believe Baldwin's work unfairly portrays America in a negative light? Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. I'd say Baldwin doesn't portray America negatively. He portrays it honestly. If the truth makes us uncomfortable, perhaps that discomfort is where we need to start. The silence that followed was punctuated by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Mrs. Watkins finally spoke, her voice breaking the tension. Isaiah, your passion for teaching is clear, and no one doubts your dedication. But we also have to consider the optics. If we approve Baldwin, what precedent are we setting? What if this decision divides the community further? Isaiah turned to her, his tone soft but resolute. Division already exists, Mrs. Watkins. Pretending otherwise doesn't bridge the gap. It widens it. My classroom is a space for dialogue, not indoctrination. My students know that. I wish the board did too. The meeting ended without resolution. As Isaiah had anticipated, Wallace promised to review the matter further before making a final decision. The board members filed out, their murmured conversations trailing behind them. Isaiah remained seated, staring at the letter in his hands. He felt the weight of the unspoken truths in that room, the fear that had silenced so many before him. As he left the library, he saw Mrs. Watkins waiting in the hallway. Her expression was softer now, tinged with something that resembled regret. Isaiah, she began, her voice hesitant, you made some strong points in there, but I'm not sure if they're ready to hear them. Isaiah met her gaze, his own unwavering. Whether they're ready or not doesn't change what needs to be said. That evening, Isaiah sat at his desk at home, his thoughts racing. He replayed the board meeting in his mind, each question and answer etched into his memory. He thought of his students, how they'd shared their own stories in class, how Baldwin's words had sparked something in them that no textbook could replicate. His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was a message from Jamal, one of his students. Mr. Reed, just wanted to say thanks for sticking up for Baldwin in class. Makes me feel like my story matters too. Isaiah read the message twice, a faint smile touching his lips. The fire he'd lit wasn't just burning in that boardroom. It was spreading, and in its light, the cracks in the facade were becoming impossible to ignore. Isaiah arrived at the school the next morning with a heaviness in his chest that felt familiar but unwelcome. The air carried the sharp chill of early autumn, the kind that hinted at the long winter ahead. The hallway buzzed with the usual chaos of students shouting to friends, slamming lockers, and scurrying to first-period classes. Isaiah's footsteps echoed as he walked to his classroom, clutching a stack of essays that felt heavier than they should. He entered his room, where the faint smell of chalk and old books lingered, and set his papers on the desk. The walls were lined with posters of literary greats, Morrison, Hughes, Whitman, but his gaze lingered on Baldwin's face, the image of the writer looking out as if daring anyone to look away. Isaiah exhaled deeply. Today, he would teach, as always, but beneath his steady exterior, the uncertainty from last night's board meeting lingered. The class filtered in slowly, students settling into their seats with a mix of chatter and groggy indifference. Jamal, one of Isaiah's more outspoken students, slouched in his chair, his hoodie pulled up. Beside him sat Elena, her brow furrowed as she scribbled in the margins of her notebook. Isaiah recognized the quiet determination in her expression. She was preparing to challenge him again today, he thought, just as she often did. As the bell rang, Isaiah stood, his presence commanding the room to quiet. "Good morning, everyone, let's get started." He turned to the whiteboard and wrote a quote in bold letters. "The paradox of education is that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which they are being educated." James Baldwin. Isaiah stepped back, his marker poised in midair. "What do you think Baldwin means here?" he asked. Scanning the room, Elena raised her hand immediately. "He's saying that education is supposed to wake you up. But once you're awake, you start to see all the cracks in the system." "Exactly," Isaiah said. "And what do you think happens when you start questioning those cracks?" Jamal leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "The system doesn't like it. They don't want you asking questions." Isaiah nodded, letting the weight of Jamal's words settle over the room. "That resistance you feel, that pushback, it's not just accidental, it's built into the system itself." Halfway through the discussion, a knock at the door interrupted them. The principal, Mr. Lyle, stepped in, his expression tight. "Mr. Reed, could I have a word?" Isaiah felt the room go still. "Of course," he said, glancing at his students. "Continue the discussion while I step out." Outside, in the hallway, Mr. Lyle folded his arms, his voice low but clipped. "I've been getting calls all morning. Isaiah, parents are upset about Baldwin. Some are threatening to pull their kids from your class." Isaiah straightened, his heart beating faster. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them we'd address their concerns," Mr. Lyle said, avoiding Isaiah's gaze. "But you're making it harder for me to defend you. Maybe, tone it down a bit?" Isaiah felt anger rising, hot and sharp. "Tone it down?" he repeated. "You're asking me to dilute the truth to make it more palatable?" "I'm asking you to keep the peace," Mr. Lyle said, his voice softening. "You got away with these kids. Isaiah, don't let this ruin it." Back in the classroom, the students' eyes followed Isaiah as he walked in, his shoulders slightly heavier now. He sat on the edge of his desk, choosing his next words carefully. "Do you know why Baldwin's work is so challenging for some people?" he asked. His tone quieter now. "It's not because he's wrong. It's because he's right, and sometimes, the truth makes people uncomfortable." The students sat in silence, their faces a mixture of understanding and unease. Isaiah felt the weight of their trust, the way they leaned into his words, waiting for him to make sense of a world that often felt senseless. Later that day, Isaiah found himself in the staff lounge. The hum of the coffee machine filled the space as two colleagues, Ms. Franklin and Mr. Harris, discussed the controversies swirling around Baldwin. "I just don't get why Isaiah doesn't stick to the classics," Harris said. "Shakespeare never caused this kind of uproar. Shakespeare's not going to help these kids understand what they're up against." Franklin shot back, her voice sharp. "Baldwin will." Isaiah cleared his throat, announcing his presence. "It's not about Baldwin or Shakespeare," he said. "It's about whether we're willing to tell the whole story." Franklin nodded in agreement, but Harris shrugged, unconvinced. "Just don't lose your job over it. Reed, these parents aren't playing around." Isaiah left the lounge with a bitter taste in his mouth. He understood the risks, but he also understood the stakes. This wasn't just about him. It was about what his students deserved. That evening, as Isaiah graded essays, he received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before answering. "Mr. Reed," a woman's voice said, firm but kind. "This is Mrs. Green. My daughter Elena is in your class." Isaiah tensed. "Yes, Mrs. Green. How can I help you?" "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Elena came home last night talking about Baldwin, about what it means to question the world around her. It's the first time I've seen her excited about school in months." Isaiah exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening. "Thank you, Mrs. Green. That means a lot. Don't let them scare you," she added before hanging up. "You're doing something important." Isaiah sat back in his chair. the echo of her words filling the quiet room. For every voice raised against him, there were others, quieter but no less powerful, standing in his corner. As he turned back to the stack of essays, Baldwin's words echoed in his mind. Not everything that is faced can be changed. But nothing can be changed until it is faced. The following days moved with a strange rhythm, like a storm brewing on a horizon that seemed too distant to fear but too close to ignore. Isaiah Reed knew the tide was turning, though the waters were still deceptively calm. In the classroom, his students continued their engagement with Baldwin, their discussions deeper and more urgent. Outside, however, the world was closing in. It began subtly. Isaiah arrived at school one morning to find a note taped to his classroom door. The handwriting was hurried, the message brief but pointed. Keep your politics out of our kids' education. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket, refusing to let it unsettle him. But the weight of its intent lingered as he stepped into the room. Greeted by the hum of students who had no idea how precarious their safe haven had become. That day, the lesson centered on Baldwin's essay A Talk to Teachers. Isaiah wrote a line on the board. What society really, ideally, wants is a citizenry which will simply obey the rules of society. If a society succeeds in this, that society is about to perish. Elena raised her hand. Mr. Reed, does he mean that obedience is dangerous? Isaiah smiled faintly. Not obedience itself. Elena, Baldwin is warning us about uncritical obedience. When people follow rules without questioning if those rules are just. Jamal chimed in. So, like when people went along with segregation laws. They didn't want to cause trouble. So they just stayed quiet? Exactly, Isaiah said, his voice steady. And silence often serves those who create the rules more than it serves those who are oppressed by them. As the bell rang, Isaiah dismissed the class. But Jamal lingered. He waited until the room was nearly empty before speaking. Mr. Reed, do you think things will ever really change? Like, for people like us? Isaiah paused, considering the weight of the question. Change isn't easy, Jamal. It's slow, and it's messy, but it's possible. It starts when people like you refuse to accept the world as it is. Jamal nodded, though his expression remained pensive. I just don't want to feel like I'm fighting all the time. Isaiah placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. The fight isn't forever, Jamal, but the world needs fighters. It needs thinkers like you. That evening, Isaiah attended a parent-teacher meeting. The principal had called it to address what he diplomatically referred to as growing concerns about Isaiah's curriculum. The room was a mix of tense faces and folded arms. Parents sitting in rows that felt more like an inquisition than a meeting. Mr. Lyle introduced Isaiah with a forced smile. Gesturing for him to speak, Isaiah stood at the front, his usual confidence tempered by the simmering hostility in the room. He spoke plainly, explaining the purpose of teaching Baldwin, the value of challenging students to think critically about the world they lived in. He highlighted the importance of historical context, connecting Baldwin's words to contemporary issues in a way that was measured but uncompromising. But the murmurs began almost immediately. A man in the front row interrupted. We send our kids to school to learn, not to be indoctrinated. Isaiah met his gaze evenly. Sir, education isn't about indoctrination. It's about equipping students with the tools to think critically and engage with the world. A woman further back chimed in. Why Baldwin? Why not focus on authors who celebrate progress instead of dwelling on the past? Because, Isaiah replied, his voice calm but firm. The past isn't behind us. It lives in the systems and structures we navigate every day. Baldwin helps us see those connections so we can move forward with clarity. As the meeting wore on, the tension escalated. Some parents supported Isaiah, but their voices were softer, almost apologetic, while others grew louder, angrier. Mr. Lyle tried to mediate, but it was clear his primary goal was to contain the conflict rather than resolve it. By the time the meeting ended, Isaiah felt drained. On his way out, a parent stopped him, a black man in his late 50s with silver streaking his hair. Don't let them shake you, the man said, his voice low. I've seen this fight before. You're doing what needs to be done. Isaiah nodded, gratitude flickering in his tired eyes. Thank you, he said simply. The next day, Isaiah arrived at school to find his desk cluttered with letters. Some were supportive, handwritten notes from students and parents who appreciated his work. Others were less kind, typed missives accusing him of pushing an agenda, of overstepping his role. One letter, anonymous, stood out for its venom. You're poisoning young minds. Leave before you're forced out. He placed the letter in the same drawer as the note from his door and locked it. He would not let fear dictate his actions. But the tension was becoming harder to ignore. That afternoon, Isaiah received a visit from Alina's mother, Mrs. Green. She entered the classroom with an air of quiet determination. Her words direct. Mr. Reed, I just wanted to say thank you. My daughter talks about your class every night. She's thinking in ways I've never seen before. Isaiah offered a small smile. Elena is bright. She's the kind of student who reminds me why this work matters. Mrs. Green hesitated, then added, I know you're facing a lot of pushback. But don't let them silence you. Our kids need you. Her words carried him through the rest of the day. A buoy against the weight of the resistance he faced. As Isaiah locked up his classroom that evening, he thought of Baldwin's words. The way they burned with truth that could not be denied. You had to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you. Not with its idea of you. The world, Isaiah realized, was still deciding who it wanted him to be. But he already knew who he was. The challenge was making sure his students knew who they could be. 2. And for that, he would endure. The air in the town had grown heavy. Like the oppressive stillness before a thunderstorm. Isaiah Reed could feel it pressing against him as he walked into school that morning. The protests against his teaching methods had moved from quiet notes and whispered criticisms to outright confrontation. The school had become a battleground, though the war was fought with words, meetings, and glances that lingered too long. The day began as unremarkable as any other, with Isaiah setting up his classroom and organizing notes for the day's discussion on Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. His students filed in, their chatter carrying a nervous energy. They could sense the tension that had enveloped their teacher but didn't know how to address it. Jamal sat at his usual seat in the front row, his notebook open and pen poised. Mr. Reed, he asked hesitantly, are we still talking about Baldwin today? Isaiah offered a reassuring smile. We are. Baldwin has a way of speaking to moments like these, doesn't he? The discussion began smoothly, with students diving into Baldwin's exploration of identity and systemic oppression. But halfway through the period, the door burst open, and Mr. Lyle, the principal, entered, his expression taut. Behind him trailed 2 members of the school board, their suits and stern faces a jarring contrast to the youthful vibrancy of the classroom. Mr. Reed, Lyle said, his tone carefully neutral, we need to speak with you. Now. The students froze, their eyes darting between Isaiah and the uninvited guests. Isaiah felt his pulse quicken but maintained his composure. Of course, he replied, his voice steady. Class, please continue discussing the text. I'll return shortly. As Isaiah followed the men into the hallway, he could feel the eyes of his students on his back. Their silent worry weighed on him. But he knew he had to focus. The meeting room was small and sterile, with harsh fluorescent lights that made everything seem more severe. Lyle gestured for Isaiah to sit. But the gesture lacked warmth. The school board members remained standing, their presence imposing. Mr. Reed, one of them began, his voice clipped. We've received numerous complaints from parents about your curriculum. They believe you are politicizing your classroom and introducing content that is inappropriate for the students. Isaiah folded his hands on the table, meeting their gazes evenly. I'm teaching literature. James Baldwin is one of the most profound voices in American history. His work challenges students to think critically about society, which is the purpose of education. The second board member, a woman with sharp eyes, interjected. Some parents feel that your lessons encourage division rather than unity. They're concerned you're pushing a narrative that paints our community in a negative light. Isaiah resisted the urge to scoff. Baldwin doesn't paint, he reveals. If his truths make people uncomfortable, it's because they're grappling with their own reflections. Lyle shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to de-escalate. We're not here to stifle your teaching, Isaiah, but we need to be mindful of the community's concerns. Isaiah leaned forward slightly. Mindful of whose concerns? The parents who want their children to remain shielded from uncomfortable truths? Or the students who deserve to understand the world they're inheriting? The meeting ended without resolution. But the warning was clear. Isaiah was on thin ice. As he returned to his classroom, he found his students waiting in a tense silence. Jamal was the first to speak. Are they trying to stop you from teaching us? Isaiah hesitated, then decided on honesty. There are people who don't agree with what we're doing here. But that doesn't mean we stop. It means we work harder to make sure the truth is heard. Elena raised her hand. What can we do to help? Isaiah looked around the room, at the eager and determined faces staring back at him. You can keep reading, keep thinking, and keep questioning. That's how you help. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the school. And by the end of the day, students were organizing. Posters appeared in the hallways with messages like, "Let Mr. Reed teach," and "Truth can't be silenced." A group of students even wrote a letter to the school board, demanding that Isaiah's curriculum remain intact. But the backlash from the community intensified. The following morning, Isaiah arrived at school to find the words, "Traitor," and "Divide and Conquer," spray painted across the brick wall outside the main entrance. The sight was a blow. But Isaiah refused to let it break him. He reported the vandalism to Lyle, who promised an investigation, though Isaiah doubted it would go anywhere. That evening, a special school board meeting was held. Open to the public, the room was packed, with parents, students, and community members filling every seat and spilling into the aisles. Isaiah sat near the front, flanked by a small group of supportive colleagues. The tension in the room was palpable. Parents took turns speaking at the podium, their voices ranging from impassioned defenses of Isaiah to angry accusations. "We don't need someone teaching our kids to hate themselves or their country," one man bellowed. His words met with a smattering of applause. A mother stood next, clutching a handwritten statement. "Mr. Reed has taught my daughter to think critically, to question the world around her. Isn't that what education is supposed to do?" When Isaiah was finally given the chance to speak, he rose slowly, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. "I became a teacher because I believe in the power of education to create change," he began. James Baldwin once said, "The world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in." That is what I teach my students. To see the world as it is, and to imagine what it could be. If that's divisive, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we mean by unity. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, a single student in the back began clapping. Others joined in, their applause growing until it filled the room. That night, Isaiah sat at his kitchen table, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. His students were with him, and that meant the world. He opened Baldwin's The Fire next time to his favorite passage and read aloud to himself. "If we do not dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water. The fire next time." Isaiah closed the book and exhaled deeply. The fire had come, but he was ready. The town hall was packed. Rows of folding chairs lined the floor, each occupied by a face set in various shades of tension, the skeptics with arms crossed, the supporters leaning forward with quiet determination, and the undecided, their eyes darting nervously between speakers. Isaiah stood at the edge of the stage, the hum of voices and shuffling papers a backdrop to the storm brewing within him. This was the culmination of weeks of contention, whispers, and outright confrontation. It wasn't just about a curriculum anymore. It was about the soul of the community. And Isaiah knew that tonight's meeting could determine not only his career but also the future of open dialogue in a town wrestling with its identity. Principal Lyle opened the meeting with his usual bland professionalism. "We're here tonight to discuss the concerns raised regarding the content of Mr. Reed's classroom. We welcome all voices in this discussion and hope to find a solution that reflects the values of our community." Isaiah resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Reflects the values of our community? Which values? Whose voices? The polite language of neutrality felt like a betrayal. The first speakers were predictable. Parents who accused Isaiah of pushing an agenda, of making their children feel bad about their heritage. A man in a flannel shirt stood, his voice sharp. "My son came home asking if America was built on oppression. What kind of teacher plants those ideas in a child's head?" Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. When the man finished, a young woman in the second row stood. She was one of Isaiah's students, her hands trembling as she clutched a piece of paper. "Mr. Reed didn't plant ideas," she said, her voice wavering but resolute. "He taught us to ask questions. He taught us to think for ourselves." Her words stirred a ripple of murmurs. Some approving, others dismissive. Isaiah felt a surge of pride but knew the hardest part was still ahead. A middle-aged woman in a floral blouse approached the microphone. Her tone was polite but cutting. "Mr. Reed," she began, "I don't doubt your intentions. But don't you think there's a way to teach history without making it so divisive? Our children need hope, not guilt." Isaiah rose from his seat, walking deliberately to the podium. The room fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. "Thank you for your question," he began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I understand the discomfort that comes with facing hard truths. But history isn't about making us feel comfortable. It's about helping us understand who we are, where we've been, and how we can do better. Hope doesn't come from ignoring the past. It comes from confronting it and choosing to create a better future." A smattering of applause broke out, but it was quickly stifled by a glare from a man in the back row. Isaiah pressed on. James Baldwin once wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed. But nothing can be changed until it is faced. That's what I teach. Not guilt, not division, but the courage to face the world as it is." The tension in the room was palpable as a new speaker took the stand. She was a grandmother with silver hair and a kind but firm expression. "I'm not here as a critic or a supporter," she said. "I'm here as someone who's lived long enough to know that hiding from the truth doesn't protect us. It weakens us." She paused, scanning the room. "I grew up in this town. I've seen it change. But I've also seen what happens when we pretend the uglier parts of our history don't exist. Mr. Reed is giving our children a gift. The gift of understanding. Don't take that away from them." Her words hung in the air, heavy with wisdom and unspoken history. For the first time that night, the room seemed to exhale. After hours of debate, the board reconvened to deliver its decision. The room fell silent as Lyle took the microphone. "After careful consideration, we have decided to allow Mr. Reed to continue teaching his curriculum with minor adjustments to ensure alignment with district guidelines. We will also be implementing a review of all history courses to promote balance and inclusivity." The decision was a compromise. But Isaiah felt a wave of relief. The fight wasn't over, but he had held his ground. More importantly, he had shown his students that standing up for what's right was worth the struggle. As the crowd dispersed, Isaiah lingered in the now empty hall. The grandmother approached him, her steps deliberate. "You remind me of Baldwin," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Not because you write like him, but because you fight like him." Isaiah smiled, the weight of the evening lifting just slightly. "Thank you," he replied. "That means more than you know." As she walked away, Isaiah stood alone for a moment, the quiet of the hall settling around him. This town, this school, these people, they were still his. And tomorrow, he'd walk back into that classroom and keep teaching, keep pushing, keep fighting. Because if Baldwin had taught him anything, it was this: the battle for truth was never easy. But it was always worth it.